Why don't we talk about why, after Brexit, the obvious reply from the established media to the Brexit vote was to make sure there's a northern columnist, a working class columnist, a Brexiteer columnist in every major national newspaper. Like in America, they should have had, I know this will trigger a lot of people, they should have had a pro-Trump person on every newspaper, every TV channel.
They did.
No, but it's in...
They do!
Established institutions, the BBC. By the way, we've had low growth rates for 10, 15 years. Our productivity problem is still as strong as it's ever been. Regional inequality is as sharp as it's ever been. And people then just say, well, just have more immigration because that's going to solve everything. Yet we've had that for 20 years.
The right has been in power for 13 years. And then we go, do you know who's to blame for this? It's the left. It's the left. I cannot bear this constant thing of the left being told, you bastards, you better sort this out, this mess you've made, the damn left, with your damn wokeness. Like, no, the right has been in power for my entire life.
Do you want to have a go at defining traditional values for us?
Yeah, people who prioritise order, stability, conformity in society, who feel more instinctively anxious about rapid change.
It's just small c conservatism, isn't it?
It's small c, I would say, yeah, cultural conservatism.
The Diggers, the Suffragettes, the Chartists, the Levellers, they are all British traditions as much as any other, and that's what annoys me about this. It's the notion that British tradition is conservatism, and that
I've never said that.
Oh, no, you kind of did.
Hello, and welcome to this PoliticsJOE debate. My name is Ollie Dugmore, and I will be chairing the discussion. I'm joined by journalist and media commentator Mic Wright, and author Matthew Goodwin, whose book, Values, Voice and Virtue, is the reason that we're talking. It seeks to define a new elite in British society and gives us our central premise, whether or not British society is now controlled by a new elite. Both sides are going to make introductory remarks. We'll have some free-flowing discussion, and then I'll ask both to make a closing statement. Matt, seeing as it's your theory we're debating, I'd like you to set out your stall first. Is British society controlled by a new elite?
It is, yeah. And firstly, thanks for having me along. I appreciate it, and thanks for everyone for tuning in. Let me just get straight to my argument. What I'm saying in this book is that we have a new elite in the country that is mainly comprised of university graduates whose parents tended to be in the managerial, professional classes, who have often gone to Oxbridge, Russell Group universities, who have moved into the big cities and the university towns, or who were already in those areas, who have hoovered up most of the gains of our globalized economy, and who today disproportionately dominate most of the institutions in the country, from the BBC to the universities to the House of Commons to the creative industries to a large part of the media, and who crucially over the last 10 years, partly in response to Brexit, partly in response to things like Donald Trump, have been moving rapidly leftwards on cultural issues like immigration, Brexit, gender, history, sex, and so on. And in this way, by moving leftwards, what I'm suggesting is that they're taking many of the institutions with them, leaving millions of people with a sense that they're no longer represented and recognised or even respected in the institutions and the national conversation. And that, in essence, is the thesis of the book.
Mick, I assume you're going to critique what Matt said. You're taking on the side of the premise Britain is not controlled by a new elite. So
I think it's controlled by an elite. I don't think it's controlled by a new elite. I'm on the left. Of course, I believe in that there is an elite. I think the elite is more about money. I think the question around, I'm very interested. This book, time and time again, talks about Oxford, Cambridge and Russell Group universities. I have an issue with it for a number of reasons. I'm the first person in my family to go to any university. I happen to go to Cambridge. Going to Cambridge immediately becomes this thing that people say to you, oh, you went to Cambridge. Well, both of my parents from very working class backgrounds. They were both in the Royal Navy. The whole idea that Cambridge was force multiplier for me is an interesting one, because when I left university, I didn't have the elite advantages of many people I was at Cambridge with, family, money, connections, all of that kind of thing. So what I realised quite quickly is that Cambridge was useful in some respects. It's a good thing to have on a CV, but it didn't propel me through the media. I started out on Pensions World magazine, the Trade magazine, because Cambridge could only get me so far. So I have issues with this new elite thing, particularly around 50%. You know, when we've got around 50% of people going to university starts to become less interesting as a factor. right? Because I know a lot of people who have gone to university who are now delivery riders, right? Because the economy is not giving them the jobs that they would expect from being at university. So there's a big question to say about the Blairite idea of like we send 50% of people to university. Was that a problem? I think it probably was. Did we fail to invest in trades or that kind of thing? But most of my family are working class. My cousins are working class. They earn better than me. They have they own houses. I don't still, nearly 40. So it's more complex, I think. And the notion of this new elite, I have some problems with it, particularly.
Well, we'll get into those.
I have some problems particularly around it because I think, unfortunately, some of the things that Matt says tip over into kind of dangerous rhetoric, in my opinion.
Okay, sure. We'll get there. So I was going to ask you, Matt, whether the three of us qualified as new elites.
Right.
Mick's kind of thrust himself into the limelight there. So why don't we start? You can provide an analysis of whether Mick's part of the new elite, but then more broadly, do the three of us sat here talking in front of these cameras, do we constitute that new elite?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we have some things in common. I mean, we were both first people in our family, to go to university. I went to the University of Salford, which is on the outskirts of Manchester, is close to the steel factories my grandfather worked in. But I imagine going to Cambridge, and I'd let Mick speak for himself, but I imagine being within that environment, you probably observed and came quite close to the group that I am referring to, which is lots of people who do end up going to Oxbridge and Russell Group tend to come from families that are already dominated by university graduates who are typically very economically affluent, who tend to have benefited from the expansion of university-based meritocracy. And I looked at the evidence for the book on who benefited from the expansion of the universities. You're an outlier, Mick, basically. Over the last 30, 40 years, the main kids who benefited from Tony Blair and John Major's commitment to expanding universities were the children of the new elite, children who came from already privileged middle-class professional families. It was kids like my mates at school and others who came from blue-collar families who were the most likely to leave school at 16, not even go into technical colleges, not go back into the education system, and were then completely cut adrift by the universities and the new elite who, to be frank, didn't really give a monkeys about anybody who didn't qualify for their vision of what a successful life is, which is going to one of the elite universities and getting a degree. So the system has been rigged, actually, in favour of this group and their kids. And it's also been rigged in what we can see today, such as the story only a couple of weeks ago, where you get a prestigious university like Cambridge falling over itself to offer degree programmes to children from minority backgrounds, but refuse to make the same spaces available for kids from the white working class. And that, to me, is another symbol of something we'll come to talk about, which is how the new elite are embracing this ideology of radical progressivism, which again is reinforcing their position while excluding others.
Would you be able to just talk a little bit more? I'll come to you in a second, Mick.
Because I'm going to lose my place otherwise.
Could you talk a little bit more about their ideology of this new elite? What do they think? What do they believe?
Yeah, so ever since I've released this book, I think people have said, well, you're having a go at the liberal elite. And partly I am, but I think we need to be very careful about what I mean by that. When I talk about a liberal new elite, what I'm talking about are people who embrace economic liberalism. They're okay with globalization. They're okay with basically the economic settlement that we've had since Thatcher, and which Blair continued. And they're okay with cultural liberalism, with large-scale migration, with the erosion of the traditional cultural guardrails that held society together, family, national identity. They tend not to care so much about the nation. You know, they're quite skeptical of calls to strengthen the family, and they feel less attached to what we'd call our ascribed identities, our national identities, our regional identities, because members of the new elite are achievers. They see themselves as high-flying liberal graduates that are in the city. They're having a great time, they're hanging out with other members of the new elite, they're marrying other members of the new elite. The graduate class are the most likely to marry one another, to only socialise online with one another, and they're the most likely to unfriend, block, and I would argue harass people who express a different political belief system to their own, which is what we've seen during the publication and the release of this book. So over time, what I'm saying is that this group have basically segregated themselves from everybody else, and I think that's contributed to this problem. And there's about 15% of Britain within this new elite. The new elite I estimate to be about 20–25% of the country, which I accept, Mick, is a larger definition of the elite than the old elite. But about 15% of Britain now embraces this very specific ideology of radical progressivism, or what you might call woke. And I appreciate some people don't like the use of the word woke. What do I mean by that? Well, they're obsessed with fixed group identities. Individuals are relegated behind fixed group identities. They are skeptical of the scientific method. Any evidence which doesn't support their claims, they are dismissive of. So they're really not in tune with the values of the Enlightenment. And they are very skeptical, if not hostile, towards the things that have traditionally held our national community together. National identity, national history, shared values. So what I'm arguing is this 15% is actually the real problem. If I'm being provocative, right, I'll be provocative. The woke,
surely not.
The woke are the real problem, basically, at the moment, because they're not liberal. They're illiberal in a number of key ways. And I spent a lot of my time studying the populist right. And over the last, I'd say the last 5 years, I've become convinced, no doubt Mick will disagree strongly, that the radical cultural left is as much a challenge to modern liberal representative democracy as the populist right.
Wow. Okay, we'll get to that. Mick's got a lot to respond to there. So let's start with the new elite and the definition of the new elite.
Well, the thing about saying, oh, you probably met a lot of the new elite at Cambridge, not really. I met the old elite. I saw the drinking clubs. I see Bullingdon as Oxford, but I saw the old elite. The first day, the thing is, I went to Homerton College, right, which is a predominantly had an intake of state school people at that point. It was much higher state school intake. It's the youngest college in the university, or at least it was at that point. Was previously the teaching place, right? So I have a slightly different perspective because my college was an outlier college. Probably wouldn't have got in otherwise, right? When I went and dealt with people from other colleges, the St. John's, the Trinities, I once spoke to someone and said, oh, what school did you go to? And I said, oh, I went to Thetford Grammar School. And they said, is that a school? Because they were thinking Eton, Winchester, Harrow. And so when I get into this thing about new elites, we have yet another cabinet that's dominated by public school boys. We have a run of prime ministers where most of them went to Eton. Like, this is... So my problem partly with this is...
But they're not on a cultural left.
No, but wait, because I didn't talk when you were talking.
Okay.
No, sorry, that was a bit harsh on me, but in fairness, I let you run quite a long speech, and I will take my time.
Please do.
So, that's a problem for me, that I keep meeting the actual elite, and the actual elite keep being in government. I think that the glaring absence in this book is about the influence of media. Now, of course, I think that there have been certain people on the left and on the centre who are obsessed with the idea of Russia or conspiracies around Brexit, right? Now, I went to Rotherham to report a piece for a newspaper. I won't name the newspaper because I just don't want to do it publicly, but I went there and I went to Rotherham. I spent 2 days in the pubs of Rotherham talking to people and saying, tell me why you voted for Brexit. Like, what's the deal with Brexit? And their thing was, the European Union didn't give us anything, right? Now, actually, when you look at it, they actually got quite a lot of funding from the European Union, but it didn't feel like they got funding. It felt like Rotherham was left behind, right? So I'm totally there for this notion that the reason that the EU was rejected is because central government didn't give the benefits of European Union membership to places. They were left behind. Rotherham was left behind. It wasn't because they were racist, although they were quite a few racists that I met in those pubs, but they're also just people who felt like, we don't have anything. We've got nothing, let's try something different. But the notion that the new elite is behind this, I think also this notion of, it's an analysis where power and power relations seems to play less. I get this notion about culture, right? But I think, quite frankly, that this has been a very useful thing for the newspapers to talk about an enemy within. It's like the paranoid style in American politics and how they used to write about paranoia in American writing. There's this notion of the woke, this enemy within, this group that are undermining the traditional values. I also think some of this talk gets a little bit too like flag, family and soil for me. Now, I don't necessarily think that's your intent, but it sounds like it a lot to me. And there's a quote, I will stop at this point, but there's a quote I'd like to read. I thought this could have been from your book, and this is almost the premise of your book. The old elite had a sense of obligation to country and community, but the new ruling class, more merit-based, brainy and mobile, puts patriotism far down the list in hierarchy of values. It is a question of whether they think of themselves as British at all. Now, that is a paraphrasing of Christopher Lash's The Revolt of the Elites. Before we started filming, we were talking about that.
Great book.
But that paraphrase is from the BNP's newsletter Spearhead in March 2000. So it concerns me, some of this rhetoric, because you've studied the right. I mean, I have here an excellent paper that you wrote for Chatham House in 2011, Right Response, Understanding and Countering Populist Extremism in Europe. Sometimes I read your book and I think, boy, you're using a lot of the tactics that you didn't like in 2011. That concerns me. I've said some pretty rough things about you on Twitter with regard to this book because I think it's dangerous rhetoric in there. I think it plays to things. And I also think the absence of mentions of people such as Lord Rothermere, Rupert Murdoch. Now, people say, oh, Rupert Murdoch, his influence is waning, blah, blah, blah. But The Sun has a huge influence on broadcast. So does the Daily Mail. And you don't talk about that. You don't talk about media influence. And it worries me that you then write for The Sun, you write for the Mail. You need to keep these people on side to sell your book. And I don't think you talk about their influence enough.
We will come to this point about the populist right and whether or not your book is playing to that, but I just want you to respond to Mick's point about elites.
Yeah.
Why is it not Lord Rothermere? Why is it not Rupert Murdoch? Why is it not a hedge fund manager that you view as the elite in this country? People with real power.
Such as the hedge fund managers behind Legatum, which you've worked with.
Right. Yeah, no, I think it's a really good question. I think the first point, just on the media elite, and then come to the elite. So I mean, obviously this book I've written for The Guardian, I've done interviews for Novara, so I'm certainly not wedded to a particular kind of media outlet. I'll try to get a debate going about what we're talking about here. What is the elite and what do they believe? Because I do think that even if you're on the left of the spectrum, you've probably got a sense over the last 13 years that politics hasn't been moving in your direction. You've probably looked at Nigel Farage, Brexit, Boris Johnson, the fall of the Red Wall, and you've probably, hopefully, interrogated your priors and you've probably thought, there's something here that's not connecting. Voters are leaving us for a reason, right? And that's why I wrote the book, because this is going to challenge your priors. Like, this is going to really put you in an uncomfortable place. On the nature of the elite, I'm not saying for a second that the old elite doesn't exist, right? I talk about it in chapter 2. I say, look, if you want to look at the old elite, go down to Pall Mall, go to the private members clubs, look at the Sunday Times rich list, look at the Tory donor class, look at the people who are in the cabinet or in the government. But what I'm suggesting is that the axis of power today is tilting away from that group to this new elite graduate class who are wielding not just economic power, because they do have enormous economic power. If you graduated from Oxbridge and the Russell Group's universities with a first class or a 2-1, about 40% of that group are living in London within 6 months of graduating. They're more likely to own homes. They're more likely to have good jobs with more pay.
But the living in London
and it accumulates over time.
But the living in London thing,
let him talk.
Because otherwise what happens is we drift. We can never get to anything because it's 20 minutes later. The living in London thing, though, surely, partly you've got to say that's to do with politicians and the fact, it comes back to what we were talking about with Brexit. Politicians for decades have not looked at spreading economic power. You cannot blame young graduates for going, the jobs are in London. Like, sometimes I think that when you talk about this new elite, it's like they are actively, like, when they say they ignore other people.
But they have done.
Yeah, but they've ignored them. But partly to do with the politics and the structure of our society. You can't sort of say they're ignoring them out of some sort of deliberate. That feels
okay, Matt, come back on
the
that
wrong way round.
Come back on that point.
So a lot of elite graduates move to London where they benefit from better housing markets, economic power, cultural capital. They associate with people from within their own group, and that brings them lots of benefits. But the old elite, the way I see it is this. You can see the power of this new group by how even the old elite are being forced to respond to them. If you look at how capitalism is being reshaped, if you look at how corporations are falling over themselves, sometimes disingenuously, sometimes hypocritically, but they are nonetheless having to respond to the rise of this new value set. They're having to have DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives from head to toe. They're having to talk about history. They're having to talk about race. They're having to talk about gender equity. These are not the values of the old elite historically. These are the values of a new, radically progressive elite. Now, you can say to me, Matt, that's all hypocritical. They're doing that because they want to make more profit. Maybe. I would argue they're also doing that while imposing themselves on the public and social realm, which is not where corporations should be. And if you're on the left of politics, I hope you agree with me, because if we're happy to have corporations intervening in democracy and our civic life, well then why don't we just have a plutocracy where Amazon and Nike are running everything? And I think that even if you say, Mick, to take your point about the cabinet and prime ministers, let's take the argument.
But see, now we've moved away from corporations.
No, we'll come back to corporations.
But we don't, because what happens is you do this thing where you do about 15 points, and it's a galloping thing.
Can I just answer the...
There's always like 15 things in any answer.
Just a conservative point, because I think it's important. Here's another way you can see the power of the new elite. If you're a conservative supporter, you're probably thinking right now the Conservative Party isn't really conservative at all. If you look at immigration post-Brexit, if you look at the embrace of gender identity theory and the refusal of the Conservatives to push back against that, if you look at the refusal of the Conservative Party to reform the Equalities Act, if you look at the refusal of the Conservative Party to reform much of New Labour's legislative legacy, what I would interpret that as, and I appreciate Mick may have different views, I would interpret that as a reflection of just how strongly entrenched this new consensus has become, that the Conservatives have been forced to respond to the rise of the new elite. Large numbers of voters would love to see, after Brexit, immigration reduced. It's gone up.
So then, Mick, corporations have been pulled to the left by this new elite, and as have the Conservative Party. Okay, why do you think that?
Because corporations, right. Citizens United in the US, right? This whole notion, like where the American law ended, American, jurisprudence essentially made corporations into people, right? Well, they're not people. There's a good film called The Corporation, which basically says if you look at the way corporations behave, if you consider them as entities, they're basically psychopaths, right? So, like a psychopath, a corporation will look at the world and say, oh, I'll give you another example. Bill Hicks used to do this routine where he said about the woke, the progressive dollar or whatever. That's what they're doing. Their whole notion is around saying, there are some people that want us to look progressive, so we'll do that, right? But then they will also have their anti-woke brands or their more masculine conservative brands. And when you look at who controls the boards of the massive corporations, you look at BlackRock and Vanguard's are big investors in all of those. Obviously, it's for their clients. There's this thing online where people go BlackRock and Vanguard, but actually they're managing client money. But the whole thing with corporations is their influence on politics is bad, but their influence in politics is through the donor culture to our very limited political parties. I was disgusted when the Labour Party started going, hey, the donors are coming back. Because what that says to me as a voter is, screw you, the donors are coming back and we're going to give them what they want. Like, that's where the money, you don't pay money to a political party unless that party gives you something. And what's annoying me about journalism at the moment is what should have happened before 97 is they should have started looking at the donors that were flooding to Labour, because that's why we got Bernie Ecclestone, that's why we got the Hinduja brothers. We'll have that with the Starmer government when it comes in. You'll notice that there will be these people who will benefit from it. Refusal to push back on gender identity from the government, that's not true. Kemi Badenoch's in there, very hardcore on gender identity. They've interfered with Scottish politics to push back on gender identity. There's a lot of rhetoric coming from the government. And also, frankly, I don't accept the idea gender ideology. Like, I have trans friends. My mother's first boyfriend transitioned to become a woman in the 1970s. I think that it has been used as a weapon to make a minority seem dangerous. I don't think it is. I mean, there are dangerous people in any minority. Of course, you look at the case in Scotland. That's a problem. The use of the word woke is just a branding thing from the right-wing media at this point. Often what they say is woke would have been called liberal in the past. And the final point I want to make in this section is that lots of elite people in the past have pushed the opinion or the cultural or societal view in this country. For instance, the death penalty would have never been got rid of if there hadn't been politicians who said we need to get rid of the death penalty against the general population's desire. It would not have been got rid of with a referendum. Like the statistics show, the polling shows that they would not have got rid of that then. The age of consent for gay people would never have gone up. Often minorities have to fight against the general opinion, and sometimes when I read things in this book, it sort of says stuff like they believe in progressive values. It's almost like you kind of, I know you say you attack Thatcher in it, and you do, but also sometimes you say things And it seems like you're just saying being on the left is wrong, or having progressive values is wrong. My problem with a lot of politics now is we have politicians who are cowards, who don't say what they believe, they say what they feel a focus group will agree with. You look at Keir Starmer, and he's now tacking towards attacking trans people because he believes that that is an electoral advantage to him. There are no frontline politicians now who are defending those minorities, not in my opinion. And if they do defend them, they get slapped down by the front bench. So the notion that the woke left really have any power is a very useful thing for the press, I believe. I don't see the power there. And, you know, it ends up being about language in documents and, oh, you can't say pregnant woman, which is just not true. It's not true. It's about an expansion of language, for instance, to say pregnant women and people with cervixes, because there happen to be trans men, and we're trying to make sure that people don't die of cervical cancer. This stuff it's pernicious. It's an attack on minorities. I think it's worrying, and I think the rhetoric about you know, this dangerous elite, that's always a worry. It feels like cultural Bolshevism rhetoric to me, and that's a worry to me.
Matt, do you want to come back on that, and then we'll move on?
Yeah, so I disagree with Mick obviously on a lot, but one of the
literally everything.
Yeah, one of the things that I really do feel strongly about is that what I would call radical progressivism is very, very different from liberalism. And we just need to be clear about what those differences are, because there are many people on the left, like Mick, who say, you know, this word woke is being used to discredit minority groups and it's not a real thing. Let me just be clear about what I mean by radical progressivism and why I'm worried about it. If you're a liberal, and I would describe myself as a classical liberal, I believe in individual rights. I believe that individuals should be able to do essentially what they want to do based on their character and their characteristics and whatever it is, that their hard work and so on. Radical progressivism doesn't think like that. Radical progressivism puts the individual behind their fixed group identity. It says the most important thing about you is not that you might be an individual with talent and genius and character and political views of your own. It says you're a white male, and that's the most interesting thing about you. It's basically organized around fixed group identities and a competitive identity structure which would put you at the bottom of the league table relative to, say, somebody from a minority, racial, sexual or gender background or whatever. That's why I worry about it, because it's pitting us against one another. It has no interest in the common humanity that the first era of civil rights focused on. If you go back and you read Martin Luther King's speeches, he wasn't talking about competitive identities. He actually talked about bringing in low-educated, low-income whites into the civil rights struggle. You won't get that today in the discourse of BLM. The second reason I think radical progressivism is problematic is because it rejects the objective scientific method. And I see this every day in universities. If I come up with a study tomorrow, if I came on this show to talk to you with research that suggested disparities between groups were not simply because of racism, as Tony Sewell did with the Sewell report earlier this last year, lots of people would throw their toys out the pram and say, how can you possibly deny that these disparities are because of racism? Maybe the report finds that actually family breakdown has played a role. Maybe the report finds that poverty has played a role. Maybe the report finds that regional inequality has played a role. Radical progressivism takes evidence that undermines its claims and it says, nope, not interested in that. What we're interested in is maintaining our sacred ideological creed. I worry about that as a researcher because I'm interested in objective scientific knowledge and the search for truth. And lastly, radical progressives don't only want to dilute the things that hold us together as people in a shared community. They're not just skeptical of our shared history, our shared culture, but a radical minority within that group actively repudiate who we are. They view the West fundamentally as being racist. They view societies like Britain as being structurally and institutionally prejudiced, even though all the evidence in social science shows clearly levels of racism and prejudice are falling over time, not increasing. And they fundamentally put us in a place where the only thing really that holds us together is that we are essentially part of these fixed identity groups and we're either an oppressor or we're a victim. This is a terrible place for an increasingly diverse, complicated society to be. It is not a liberal place to be. So the 15%, Mick, I'm afraid, I will always view this group with suspicion, because if their plan is enacted, the result is division.
Their plan? Where's their plan?
The ideology of radical progressivism.
Yeah, but again, I'm going to say my thing now. Like, I'm going to say, this is, with, you know...
Do you agree with Matt's characterisation of your politics?
No! No, of course I don't. And my wife said to me, don't get angry. But I am getting a little bit angry. It shouldn't, but I am. Because you talk about don't divide people. You talk about, you think about individuals. But then you are creating this group where you talk about us having plans. You know, it's like when people say the gay agenda, right? I've always thought, as like a bisexual person, I've always thought to myself, I've never been sent a copy of the gay agenda. I'm very disappointed. I want to read the gay agenda, find out what we're doing next. This notion of this new, you contradict yourself, because you say, I care about individuals, I'm a liberal, I care about individuals. But then you write about this class and that you believe exists, may or may not exist, but then you talk about them as if they, you talk about people as if they operate as like a shoal of fish, right? My politics, even coming to do this debate, there are people on the left who said, don't debate him, don't sit and talk to him, right? I talk to anyone, but my debating style is pub debating style, sat at an end of the bar and being quite... There was a moment on Twitter where you said, oh, if you're not going to be polite, don't come. But what I was meaning by I'm not going to be polite is, my point was being, I'm not going to do Oxford Union, we stand at boxes and we pretend like we totally... and that we pretend that we totally respect everything each of us is saying. Now, it doesn't mean that I'm going to like shout over you or not listen to what you say or not engage with the points, but like... If I think it's...
So on the substance of his point about your politics, what do you disagree with?
I disagree with it because, well, for instance, I just talked earlier in this discussion about going to Rotherham, going and talking to people, right? I do journalism in a way that I've seen you do journalism, Ollie, which is I go and talk to people. I haven't got an assumption, or, you know, I don't have an assumption. I use the scientific method. I have a hypothesis and I will go and talk to people and I will change my mind. The aim of that article from a newspaper that is, you know, very aggressively Remain orientated was go and show that the people in Rotherham are basically wrong, right? And I had to come back and say, I can't write the article for you because you're not going to like it, because what I'm going to say is they're not wrong. I think that they have been misled in certain ways, or not misled even. It's unfortunate, like, for instance, there are several buildings in that town that were paid for with EU money, but like it wasn't, you know, it didn't get to the people who needed it. So this whole notion of like, that I only see people by their characteristics rather than as individuals, that's not true, but I do understand that if I had been born a black boy in Tower Hamlets, where I was a school governor, my life chances would be not as good for a number of reasons. Family break, for instance, when you say, oh, it could be to do with family breakdown. Yeah, but, you know, the effects of how systems and social services, for instance, treat black families can exacerbate that. You know, the interrelationships of these things are missing sometimes in those arguments, right? I believe in the interrelationships of things. I believe in material conditions. Like I read and see a lot in Marx, right? And if I say that, we'll go, oh, well, there he is, he's a Marxist. It's like, no, you know, it was very interesting at school. No one ever talked to us about Marx. And then I started to read Marx in my 20s and went, oh, material conditions is very interesting. So that's my issue with it. That's not my politics. That's not my politics. I think you make this group and then you say you care about individuals and then you talk about the plan. If you believe in a capitalist market economy where people are individual consumers who make individual choices, right? You can't then also act as if the new elite operate in lockstep, just jackbooting their way down high streets to, you know, smash the windows of shops that inadequately woke. I don't understand. This group doesn't exist in this way. Of course, there are, you know, cultural similarities between people. And I also think this reads like an obsession with the Russell Group also. When you look at actually performance, there are universities outside the Russell Group who perform better. Oxford and Cambridge are the outliers in the Russell Group. There are non-Russell Group universities that perform better in terms of you know, research-intensive universities. So I worry as well about this notion that the Russell Group is somehow, you know, like this powerful cabal. Like, There's lots of people in the former 1994 group who are very good universities. Kent, where you are on staff, is a good university. We are obsessed in this country with Oxford and Cambridge, and I will say this: I went there, it was fine. A lot of it was like not as good as you think. The only good thing that they have there that I wish they had at other universities is a supervision system where you get to sit with lecturers in small groups. That's an incredible educational advantage because your arguments are tested, and that's good, and that's what we're trying to do here.
Matt, what is the mechanism by which this sort of 15, 20, 25% graduate class, how are they exerting this control? What's the mechanism for doing that? Is there some kind of shadowy cabal orchestrating all this? What's going on?
Secret staff rooms. And,
why don't they let me in?
Yeah.
I want to go.
Just, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one. I'm also struck by Mick's point about Rotherham, because whenever I look at Rotherham, I always think, in essence, Rotherham's a symbol of, in many ways, what I'm talking about. The reason that the big scandal in Rotherham and the sexual exploitation of children was not exposed earlier on was because many people felt that they couldn't talk about the issues that they wanted to talk about because of political correctness and the imposition of this very stifling orthodoxy. And
what's your basis for saying that?
Had more journalists like Andrew Norfolk at the Times have come out earlier on and said we have a serious issue here, then I think actually a lot of kids would have been saved and protected before some of the horrific things that happened. And the Casey Review is very clear at saying that one of the reasons why few people called it out at the time was because they were scared of being called a racist.
My understanding of reading that Casey report was that there was a gross negligence on the behalf of the police officers who looked down their noses at the victims because they thought they were of a lower standing in class.
Well, there's a lot of complicated,
are you seriously
intricate. Well, Casey,
political correctness. That's your explanation for what happened there.
It's not monocausal, but the Casey Review is very clear at saying that one of the reasons why people did not call out that scandal, and read Andrew Norfolk's account in the Times. He said how difficult it was to get that story published, and why so few other journalists were looking at it was because it was deemed to be too sensitive. And this is an issue that if we look, for example...
Just on the Times question, though,
yeah, sure,
I will say, you've got to look at other stories around the Times, such as the story about adoption. The Times and certain journalists there, whose names I'm not going to get into because you'll have an editing job. There was stuff around adoption and around race that the Times has not got a spotless record when it comes to truthful reporting on race and issues around this. Now, is race a factor there? In Rotherham, of course it's a factor, but also, and people don't like people saying it, but the breakdown of child sexual abuse offenders in the UK, pretty much like percentage-wise, is pretty in lockstep with the percentage of those ethnicities in the country, right? So most child sexual abusers are white, and that's so. But they get reported less loudly, less prominently. Their ethnicity is less a factor in the way those stories are reported. I could pull examples, a pile of examples. I haven't brought them with me because I was trying to do many other things. But that is an issue, and when we say race isn't a factor, race is certainly a factor in reporting. It's like nationality is a factor in reporting. A Bulgarian rapist will be a Bulgarian rapist. An English rapist is not an English rapist. That's a factor, and it's the cuts are there. You can pile them up.
We've
on your question,
okay, sure.
which I didn't sidetrack from. No, there isn't a secret cabal. But what I'm saying is that if you look at the evidence across Western democracies, the elite graduate class is steadily drifting away from the rest of society in terms of their politics. So over the last 12 years, graduates have swung sharply towards Labour and Liberal left parties. In terms of their economic experience, not all graduates, obviously, but the elite graduate class, people from more professional, secure families, have had a very different economic story from everybody else. And in terms of their values, culturally, they've moved sharply leftwards on these issues. So there's not a secret cabal, but what I'm saying is, there's a great Democrat pollster, David Shaw, and I know Mick will know David. He's advised Obama and others. He's a very interesting guy. He says the biggest problem facing American politics today is education-based polarization, which is the way in which the graduate class a minority class are drifting away from everybody else. And what I'm saying in this book is something very similar. Mick, this is a class with class interests, and as you know, every class has its own class interests. The new elite are no different. They're pursuing interests, consciously, subconsciously, whatever, to advance the goals of their group, and their group has a very specific thing that it wants to accomplish. It wants to maintain and expand its power, influence, and dominance. It's not a conspiracy, it's just education polarization.
Okay, but my question to that is, a lot of the things that you say that those people believe in, right? You imply, heavily imply, that those are bad things, right? Repeatedly.
Well, I think radical progressivism is a problem.
Whoa. Yeah, I know you do. You've made that very clear. But my issue with this is that, again, I come back to it, traditional values, right, is a phrase that, to my mind, it means something and nothing, because traditional values shift, right? I'm going to do a personal anecdote, which is always an annoying debate tactic, but I'm doing it anyway. Every Friday I go and see my grandmother. My grandmother is 90 years old, and I ask her about all sorts of things, because I'm really fascinated about her as basically a living, a witness of living history, right? And I said to her recently, when did the 60s start for you, right? Because she was a housewife with a husband who was in the Metropolitan Police, living in London from the 50s till the early 70s, right? She said, I don't know, probably about 1965, right? Because and then she wasn't allowed a bank account till well into the 70s, right? So traditional values to me, my question the whole time with this was, tell me what year the traditional values should be from. And the other aspect of this, with this whole progressivism thing, is I talk to my gran about the newspaper. She gets the Express, right? But she thinks the Express is full of shit. But she likes the crossword, right? She used to get the Telegraph, but it's more full of shit. And that's how she feels about it. She's 90 years old. And I said to her, we were talking about the trans issue, as people insist on calling it. This is people's lives. I hate that rhetoric. And I was talking to her about this, and she said, well, I don't know. And I said this on Twitter, and people said, this didn't happen. Well, whatever, this didn't happen, people. It did happen. And she said, well, I don't really care what... Her view, because she's 90, she's hardly progressive. She was like, I don't care what they do. I don't really want to know about it, but I don't care what they do. Yeah. If they're just people living their lives, it's fine, right? And so this is a 90-year-old woman, and the whole concept of, so that's pretty progressive for her age. She's gone from being in a place where, when planes went over in Norfolk, it was a shock, there's a plane, to a woman who uses her iPad daily, right? So this whole notion of traditional values, I just don't buy it.
Sure, so Matt,
I don't buy it.
do you want to have a go at defining traditional values for us?
Yeah, people who prioritise order, stability, conformity in society, who feel more instinctively anxious about rapid change.
It's just small c conservatism, isn't it?
It's small c, I would say, yeah, cultural conservatism, people who want to respect and uphold traditional sources of authority and institutions, who probably supported Brexit. I mean, let's make it real. Let's talk about policies.
Yeah.
Probably supported leaving the European Union, probably are okay with immigration, but would like to lower the overall level and slow the pace of immigration.
But do you think the debate on immigration in this country is at all serious? Because we don't talk about, or people try to. We talk about numbers, right? And so David Cameron says, get it under the tens of thousands, right? Which is stupid. It was never going to happen, right? We don't talk enough about, well, what are the effects of immigration? Now, of course, the right will always say the effects are people lose jobs. Areas are, it's difficult for areas where there is a lot of immigration in a small area. But that's to do with national government and the relationship to councils. I think we have a problem with not saying, well, what level of immigration do we need? I was seriously ill recently. I collapsed 3 times, had to go to hospital. The doctor who treated me was from Nigeria. The phlebotomist was, I think, from Zambia. Most of the staff that I engaged with were not born in the UK. And so we need that immigration, right? We need those people.
Hang on.
No, right, stop, and you can come back and tell me I'm wrong. But at the moment, we have a situation where we don't train enough doctors, right?
Amen.
And I'm glad that I'm not dead, right? And they were brilliant at their jobs. And with Windrush, the people we have screwed over, this government has screwed over, the Windrush generation came over because we did not have enough people who wanted to do those jobs, to be bus drivers, to do a lot of jobs. We didn't have the people to do that. The notion that immigration has to be a negative is just this accepted thing. and that's a problem. Because
don't
it's
think
unserious
I don't
debate.
think
It's
that's true,
unserious debate.
Let Matt
I
come
don't
back
think
to you.
that's true. People have become more positive over the last 10 years about immigration, especially since Brexit. They've become more relaxed overall about migration and its effects on the country. But that's not to say that a large majority do not want to reduce the overall amount of immigration.
What do they know about it? That's the question I'm asking.
Well, can I?
That's what I want to know. No, but that's what I really want to know.
Suggest a few things.
Yeah, go on.
Firstly, they know that they've been lied to and misled for 20 years by parties on both the left and the right. They know that the estimates...
20 years is optimistic.
They know that the estimates of the level of change that they would see were wildly inaccurate, that all of the forecasts over the last 2 decades have been proven to be wrong. They know that they were given an economy that used to actually make things and be productive and has instead been turned into an economy that has been hollowed out and is now dependent upon importing cheap migrant labour in order to fuel consumption. That's what Britain's economy has become.
And who's to blame for that?
What I'm saying is partly the new graduate class have gone along with that, because if you question, as this debate is revealing, if you...
I love this game. If anyone disagrees with you, it reveals that you're right. That's just the horseshit way of doing it.
Let him
finish. If you question immigration at all, I'm not here saying I don't want immigration. I'm not saying I oppose immigration. What I'm saying, Mick, is if you question whether this political economy has been good for workers, has been good for the country, has been good for areas outside of London and university towns, you are quickly seen, branded in a negative way by the new elite. You are seen as being somebody who is instinctively problematic, and that is, I find, very troubling.
See, I think this is unserious because the issue that I have with this is I'm not saying that immigration is not a complex question. Workers have been screwed over constantly. Workers of all types. There is brilliant reporting. I've shared it recently from the Bureau of Investigative Journalists, looking at how migrant workers are being treated in this country. Appallingly treated, right? So that's a huge problem with immigration, right? That we're bringing people in and treating them appallingly. On farms, they are being treated appallingly. I don't believe we should have an economy like that. But I don't blame. But my issue is the way immigration is talked about. It is always shaped around blaming the immigrants who've come. It's about talking about negatives. It's very often not talked about. For instance, how much immigrants bring into the country, how the economic value in terms of, you know, they claim fewer benefits, they work harder, they work longer hours. Like, there are it's a complicated thing. What you want to say to me is, if I come back to you and say I don't agree with what you say about immigration, you immediately think, well, he's the new elite and he just loves immigration. He just wants unrestrained immigration. That is like, man, there are so many straw man in this. I just felt like...
So how much should we have?
Here's the thing with what is the number, right? The number for me is complicated. You know, I think it's unserious to say we'll have it under the tens of thousands.
I don't think it's complicated at all.
No, well, you don't and I do. We differ. My answer is, I am not an economist with a speciality in immigration, but I have talked to people who are, and they talk about you know, having quotas, having for different industries, things like that. I have no problem with that. But the notion of always talking about immigration as a negative, framing it as a negative, encouraging people to be afraid, it is about divide and conquer, and it comes back to you saying, I want people to bring people together. This is not bringing people together. And also, the sharing of graphs, like the graph that you shared recently about the non-white British, non-white people in London, right? I know it wasn't your graph. I think it was Eric's graph, right? But Ash Sarkar's argument of saying my partner is white, you know, I'm mixed race, and if we have a child, it's going to be a non-white child in London. It's problematic to me, some of this stuff, because British people who aren't white are still British people, and it bothers me, because when we get het up on immigration in the way we are, not talking about it seriously, I think we should have a debate on immigration, but we're not talking about it seriously. I think people of colour in this country suffer for it. They are as British as I am, and the immigration thing in the way the press talks about it ends up being a problem for people of colour, and that's a problem.
Mick, can we not? Let's not turn this debate into somebody likes immigration and somebody else doesn't like immigration.
I didn't say, yeah, but that's not what I said.
I know, but this debate isn't about that.
But it's not what I said.
But your example of the NHS, I'll give you one thing which I think maybe we'll agree on because you referenced it. Here's one example of why I think people feel uncomfortable with what's happening now. You look at the NHS crisis. Well, one of the roots of that crisis is last year we trained 6,000 doctors overall here. We had places for about 6,000 doctors. We brought 2,000 in from Europe and we brought 12,000 in from outside of Europe. As you say, right, we're not training enough doctors. We don't give enough medical places to A-level students. And one of the big contributing factors to the NHS crisis is the lack of available GPs and doctors coming through the system. Now, I would argue that one obvious way to deal with that is to have an open and frank conversation about how we can press the people who are in charge of political power in this country to increase the number of medical places, to have more kids coming through British schools going on to be GPs and doctors, and we need to be less reliant on drawing in doctors, often, by the way, from low-income, developing countries. Nobody wants to engage with this moral question, but it's really important. Should we be
I'm happy to engage with that moral question.
Should we be taking doctors from Pakistan, India, Nigeria, and elsewhere at the rate that we're doing? Is that the moral thing to do? Is it the right thing to do? Or should we actually be reforming the system so that we can actually contribute to fixing our NHS crisis? And the reason I talk about these voters in this book, and I don't think this book is divisive at all, I think this book is just challenging, is I think many voters are out there looking at this political economy that we've got at the moment and thinking, this is bananas, this is not actually serving anything. And by the way, we've had low growth rates for 10, 15 years. Our productivity problem is still as strong as it's ever been. Regional inequality is as sharp as it's ever been. And people then just say, well, just have more immigration because that's going to solve everything. Yet we've had that for 20 years. So I think people aren't idiots. I think people are looking around and thinking, actually, there must be a different way of doing this. There must be another political economy out there that other advanced Western nations are pursuing. So why are we on this particular model that's been pushed in by New Labour, carried on by David Cameron and George Osborne, and now looks like it's going to be with us for the foreseeable future?
See, I think that we need to train more doctors. I think that. I agree with that. I think we need to train more doctors. But do I think it's a moral problem that you take doctors from countries that need them? Of course it's a moral problem. Like it is a moral problem. But also, do I believe that people should have the right of movement around the world? Do I think that people should be able to move from one country to another? Yeah, I do. So it's more complicated than that as well. I can't just say to, Pakistani doctors, particularly in countries which, were part of, or, were in the empire, to say, you can't come here. I have a problem with that. It's complicated. My issue keeps coming back. What keeps coming back to me here is the right has been in power. Now, of course, there's the Peter Hitchenses of the world, you to an extent, who argue that this government is not right. It is not a right-wing government, right? It's a sort of it's a sort of populist, do whatever we think might work kind of government. That's kind of true. But the right has been in power for 13 years. And then we go, do you know who's to blame for this? It's the left. It's the left. The left. It's crazy to me. That just on a basic level, that drives me crazy because it's the Conservative Party, and before that, the Blair and Brown administrations, I don't see as particularly left-wing governments. They were,
I agree.
Neoliberal governments, right? So I cannot bear this constant thing of the left being told, you bastards, you better sort this out, this mess you've made, the damn left with your damn wokeness. It's like, no, the right has been in power for my entire life. I have never lived under a government that did anything left-wing, because I was born in 1984. Thatcher. I lived through Thatcher. Then I had Major. Then I had Blair. Then I had Brown. Then I had Cameron. I've never had just a delicious taste of some left-wing. Never once. Never once. Never for a moment. Nationalisation, just a complete. Not allowed. Can't happen. It's madness.
Something that I think perhaps you both do agree on is that Brits have become disenfranchised with politics. Okay, perhaps
I mean,
not. We'll find out.
No, you'd be an idiot to say they haven't.
Okay,
fine.
So that's the only thing you agree on, because it's
you can't buy can't buy a house. You can't. Nothing works. We know that. The Trash Future is a great podcast, and they have this thing where they say that Britain now is the Soviet Union but shit and expensive, and that's basically where we are.
And also, I think that neither of you are, well, definitely from what you just said, Mick, particularly big fans of the major political parties in Britain. So if we were to start...
I tell you something we agree on, right?
Yep.
No, hang on, because it just occurs to me.
Please.
Matt has said things where he talks about the breadth of politicians allowed into... I love this because I end up being the like naughty boy in the room. It's like, well, whatever, lads. The 1945 Parliament, right, is a brilliant Parliament when you look at it. Like, you've got people who are like ex-military, you've got trade unionists, you've got all kind of like the Tories have got all their mad elite aristocrats, and the Labour Party have actually got people from organised Labour and from I have a huge problem with it. I look at the Labour Party and it's a managerial party. And the system we have now is that the Tories come in, fuck it up for a while, and then we get Labour in to manage it to a sort of a kind of stability that doesn't serve anyone. Yeah, I agree on that. Of course I do. The arguments about why and how we solve it, that is the difference. And I'm worried about the rhetoric. Hugely worried about the rhetoric.
How do we solve it?
Well, we need a much wider range of voices in politics and the institutions. They're overwhelmingly dominated by not just members of the graduate class, but often the elite graduate class. 90% of journalists now are degree holders. Half of them have gone to one of two universities. I'll let you guess which ones. The creative industries, publishing, cultural institutions, the universities obviously are basically dominated disproportionately by people who come from the same backgrounds and hold the same sets of values. So what I'm arguing or suggesting in this book is we need a much wider range of voices in the national conversation, because what the new elite will do, which is what they did very visibly after this book was published, is instantly seek to stigmatise and undermine people who challenge their dominance within the national conversation. Look, the reason I agreed to do this debate and have this discussion on this show is, whether you believe me or not, I don't care, is an alternative media ecosystem is critically important because the media has shown itself to be incapable of reforming and opening up. My students at university have no chance of getting into the Times, the FT and whatever, because they don't have the money to move to London, to rent a place, to get into that industry, in the same way that if they haven't gone to the right schools, universities, and they don't have the right amount of cultural capital, not just economic, their chance of rising to the top in politics is also very slim. The days of John Major, someone who didn't go to university, becoming, very important and powerful in politics, they're just gone. Look at the Labour Party. I mean, I think I calculated the number of Labour MPs from working class backgrounds is down to like 7 MPs. There are no trade unionists in the Labour Parliamentary Party anymore. The largest single group in the Labour Party are political careerists, people who have only ever worked in politics. Local media's gone, regional media's gone. There aren't stepping stones into the national conversation anymore that normal, ordinary people can follow. So my view, and I appreciate not everybody shares it, is we need to basically break up the institutions. And I get lots of crap on Twitter for going on, GB News and Talk TV. My view on that is, yeah, of course I'm going to go on them. They're disruptors. They're disrupting legacy institutions because the national conversation is completely dominated by an orthodoxy. In the same way I'd go on Navarro, we'd go on this show and go on whatever, because we need to build an alternative ecosystem that actually brings different voices into the conversation.
Is it contradictory for you to, on the one hand, decry the lack of competing political viewpoints and simultaneously decry the existence and the beliefs of this new elite?
Well, no, because my argument is that they are stifling, they are controlling, they are maintaining, they are dominating institutions and not allowing others to come in. To give you an example, the BBC debate over gender pay, this kind of like debate that sort of took over a summer, I think it was, and we had everybody, talking about how women in the BBC were paid less than their male counterparts. And like, that's an important debate. We should have that debate. But like, there is another debate about the BBC, which is, why is it dominated by the professional managerial classes or the children of those families? Why don't we talk about why, after Brexit, the obvious reply from the established media to the Brexit vote was to make sure there's a northern columnist, a working class columnist, a Brexiteer columnist in every major national newspaper. Like in America, they should have had, I know this will trigger a lot of people, they should have had a pro-Trump person on every newspaper, every TV channel.
They did.
No, but it's in...
They do!
Established institutions, the BBC, Radio 4 Today. Do you think Radio 4 Today accurately represents the mood of the country?
No, I think the Today programme is one of the worst programmes on British radio, but for a different reason, which is that it, and you'll probably disagree with me on this, but for instance, Justin Webb is consistently gender critical. He engages with gender critical people all the time. He's very unbalanced towards that side of things.
Why shouldn't we have gender critical people in the national conversation?
There's no problem with that if you want to have the BBC not play the impartiality game. Impartiality is a lie. The BBC is not impartial. There are lots of people who are either
But if
left
it was
or right
impartial, you'd have gender critical people.
Yeah, but that's not the problem. The problem is we're still playing the game that we have a go at it if someone is deemed to be seen to be left, right? Even if they're not, right? There's someone who was doing fact checking. No one disputed the fact checking, but they went, oh, he was left wing at university. That was in the Daily Mail, right? But Justin Webb, writing for the Daily Mail, he has the right to have gender critical views, right? But not to do interviews in an unbalanced way on the Today programme if the game is you do balanced interviews. That's the problem.
All I'm saying is,
also, why is Tim Stanley always on Thought for the Day? He's not a religious. He's a columnist for the Daily Telegraph. There's a lot of shit like that. Like, I'm constantly told the BBC is left wing. Believe me, I'm very left wing, and I don't see my opinions on the BBC.
You're about to come back.
I just think. Let's say you're a voter in Clacton, Boston, and Skegness. And you look at the adverts on television, you look at the debates that we have about who we are as a country, you look at the TV programmes and Netflix documentaries, you look at the cultural outputs, you look at the books on the bestseller list, excluding the one that Nick's got over there, which is a rare example of a countercultural take. Generally, I think those voters are looking at a lot of things that are swirling around them and just thinking, I don't recognise my values here. I don't even feel represented in this conversation. I don't even feel respected in this conversation. And the thing that I changed my views, Mick, since I wrote that report that you pointed to, and I'll tell you the one thing that really
I'm sorry I read your old work.
The thing that impacted me more than anything was the reaction to the Brexit vote. I thought it was utterly disgusting the way we talked about our fellow citizens while they were in the room listening to that national conversation. I thought it was the lowest moment in our British political national debate, where we basically consigned millions of people to being called bigots, gammons, Karens, ignorant morons. We had Times columnists getting on the train to Clacton, dismissing it as places that are going nowhere, comparing it to Beirut. I thought it was utterly disgusting, and it displayed the class prejudice of the new elite. And they would not show that prejudice towards any other group. But when it comes to Brexit voters, working class voters, non-graduates, it's acceptable. And that stinks. And that's why I called it out. And that's why my views changed partly. The reaction to the Brexit referendum was utterly, utterly unsatisfactory.
Mick, you can come back on that and then we'll do concluding remarks.
Right, well, earlier on in this discussion, I made it pretty clear that I don't not respect Brexit voters. I have Brexit voters in my family, right? I had conversations about it. My arguments for it, I was along the lines of, to be honest, along the lines of where Jeremy Corbyn was, which people are very angry about for saying, oh, he didn't defend Remain enough. But I basically thought the EU's pretty messed up. I think on balance we should stay in for these reasons. But the reason that Remain lost is it was deeply patronising, and it basically said, oh, you know, it's bad in your economic interest, you shouldn't do this. And saying sod off to the EU is a lot sexier. Like, that makes sense, and people were not respected. So this is what bothers me as well, the notion, like, maybe I'm the new elite, who knows, but I don't disrespect Leave voters because I have them in my family. I've working class, like, I am middle class through...
Do you agree with the book then?
No, I don't. That's a fun game, but saying I agree on these limited things does not mean that I agree with the whole thing. There are more...
Drew a rise out of you, the last one, didn't it?
Yeah, you know, it does. There's more straw men in this than the Wicker Man. Do you know what I mean? It's amazing. But and when you go on GB News, which is again, Lagarde, connected. It's like a warm bath. I mean, he is a pathetic interviewer. It was like you were down the pub just having a fun chat.
So who is this?
Chopper, right? He's a bad interviewer because he didn't challenge you. But I respect that you've gone on things where you have been challenged, right? But saying I went on GB News to talk to these people who aren't listened to, they're pretty listened to. They've got they've got a channel for that. They've got Talk TV. Like the right is not on. There's no left-wing channel. There's no MSNBC in the UK. This whole notion that the right.
If there was, I'd go on it.
No, I know you would, but hang on. You had longer. If you want to play this game, that there is there's vast groups of people who are ignored and treated like crap, fair enough. But the left is too, because if you are on the left, like, and you believe in genuinely left-wing things, renationalisation, for instance. The broadband policy, which was called, broadband communism on the BBC, ludicrous. When they wanted to do tree planting, that was like, this is hilarious that you plant that many trees. Actually, it was a very sensible policy. If you on the left, genuinely on the left, you get shat on by the mainstream media endlessly. And many people that I'm friends with we have to have these other, we have to have stuff like Joe, we have to have stuff like Navarro, because you are treated appallingly. Go on Politics Live, which you were on earlier, and they treat Ash Sarkar like she's, like a dog that can do a card trick. Left-wing voices are treated appallingly.
Ash Sarkar's on TV all the time.
No, yeah, but only as to be treated as a foil.
No.
Yeah, well, you see, the funny thing is as well, you say that you respect opinions, but when I sit and I just listen to you say things and you go, you're an idiot, right? Fair enough.
Mick, I never said that.
No, just your body language and your face said it. But the problem is, for me, the notion that the left is really indulged in this country is the most ludicrous idea. The left is treated appallingly. The left is slapped down constantly.
Okay.
The left is driven out of Parliament. The left has no power.
Okay.
The genuine left.
Quite important.
There's no power.
Just one thing
Matt,
I want to
you can come back. This will be your final remarks.
Yeah.
Well, okay.
Okay, I'm just going to come back on one thing, because have you ever met anybody that's worked at the Legatum Institute?
Yeah.
Who?
Naming people, but yes, I have. I've been at events, think tank events and stuff. There's been people there.
Because I think in your mind you sort of see this kind of secretive cabal.
Yes, it's a cabal. They've got a plan like the one that the new elite's got.
So I worked there for a while, and it's come up a couple of times in this interview.
Well,
so
what happened to your institute? Why did your institute
I wanted to address it.
Yeah, I'd love for you to.
In the aftermath of the Brexit referendum, the most interesting debate, in my view, in this country was levelling up. How do we level up the country? To me, that was the only interesting intellectual exercise to come out of the Brexit referendum. Because
do you feel that meant something?
Those communities.
When Boris Johnson said it.
Let him finish.
It's just interesting.
Those communities needed to have a serious policy that can begin to rectify the effects of Thatcherism and 100 years of a London-centric economy. So when I went to work at Legatum on the Levelling Up programme for a year and a half, that's what it was about, because intellectually that was the most interesting debate to be had in British politics, and it had to be led from the right, because the right were, overseeing the post-Brexit policy. That's why I went there. And I just want to put on record, they're actually really, really good people. And I know that many people on the left see people who have money and they think, well, they must be evil. I actually know those people very well intimately, and they are very good people that want to make the world a better place. When we release this book, I'll tell you,
you're doing politics of envy on me.
The only hostility I've had, the real hit jobs, speaking about how terrible everybody is to the left, have come from the left. It's been the New Statesman or Byline Times or whatever who have gone after not the argument, not the ball, they've gone after the man. And that proves the argument that I'm making in the book, Mick, which is that there is a strand on the left that cannot even engage or entertain ideas, beliefs, evidence, arguments that undermines how they see the world. So the intolerance, the political intolerance over the last couple of weeks with this book, in my experience, has not come from the right. It's come from the left.
Yeah, because it's a book. Come on, it's a book where you attack a lot of the things that the left believes in.
I challenge them.
I mean, semantics. We can play semantics all day. It's life's tough in the NFL. If you get on the pitch and you say a load of stuff about people, they're going to come back at you. I find it interesting. Like, my God, my job that I created for myself is being a media critic. I write about the media consistently and I criticize it hard. And that means I get a lot of crap because the media does not like to be criticized. And I just have to take it. And Penguin, you know, I don't have a Penguin book behind it. I perhaps will have a book soon, who knows. But
I'll take that back.
Yeah, get the book on. But the problem is that I think that you're being really thin-skinned about this. Like, the book's done well, you're doing well out of it, but you keep saying, anytime anyone criticizes you go, this proves that the new elite are intolerant. But no, you've put out a load of arguments, and I've played the man a bit. I play the man a little bit sometimes because it's fun. But I played the arguments. Look at how much I've engaged with this book, right? I've read the book. You can't play the thing of saying you haven't read the book. You can't
I've read the tweets. I'm very impressed, Mick.
I've fully engaged with the book. I've engaged with the arguments. I find them unpersuasive. But you know, and I play a studs up game. But I think that the arguments are wrong. I think in many ways there are some things in there that are right. You know, in a book that long, there's going to be some stuff that's right. You know. It's, I nearly read my granddad's medical notes there, you don't want to know those. I think you talk a lot about the British Social Attitude Survey, and I think it's an interesting survey. It's always an interesting survey. It shows that over time, lots of things have changed. You know, shows like Star Trek, MASH, Bonanza was seen as progressive in the 60s, right? They're not seen as progressive now, they're kind of old-fashioned. I think often the way you talk about history in this book, removes radicalism from British politics, and often the right talks about British politics in a way that it takes radicalism out of it. I live in Norwich. It's a radical city. It's always been a radical city. I'm related a long way back to Robert Kett, who fought against the enclosures, right? So I come from radical politics. The Diggers, the Suffragettes, the Chartists, the Levellers, they are all British traditions as much as any other, and that's what annoys me about this. It's the notion that British tradition is conservatism, and that.
I've never said that.
No, you kind of did, because you were talking about when you were asked about traditional values, you then laid out a picture of a person, and then Ollie said small c conservative, and you relatively agreed with that, right? My issue is, that's what I'm saying about the left, and also the way that the left, if the left fights back, the left look at the intolerant left. If the right does it through newspapers day in, day out, they play the man constantly. Look at how trade unionists have been personally attacked. They cannot say, oh, I'm going to attack what the BMA is saying. They have to find a trade unionist and say, this person went on holiday. It's unserious. And the left is not allowed to play dirty or fight hard. The right is. And I just do not accept that this country is not allowed to shift in directions that are progressive, or that there isn't a radical left history in this country. It's just a shame that when we cut the King's head off, we didn't get it right that time.
I would like to thank you both for taking the time for this discussion.
Thank you very much.
I appreciate it, both Matthew and Mick, but also you, the viewer. Let us know which arguments you found the most compelling in the comments. See you all very soon. Thanks again.